Chapter 55, The Racial Logic of Grey's Anatomy, Shonda Rhimes and Her Post-Civil Rights Post-Feminist Series by Christian J. Warner. Warner argues that Rhimes does not fail to acknowledge racial difference in her series Grey's Anatomy. In particular, Warner focuses on an interracial couple, and she says, though these two actors' histories are informed by them breaking racial barriers in Hollywood, Grey's insistence on not seeing the characters as racialized beings ultimately neutralizes Carol and Roundtree's achievements. The lack of racial acknowledgement, however, is not by accident. Rhimes' failure to acknowledge racial difference between these two characters of color in favor and framing it as a more simplistic odd couple trope is not by accident. But Grey's is not the first primetime dramatic series, or even more specifically, the first primetime medical series to deploy racial neutralization as a solution to racial inequity. One response, the evacuation of cultural specificity for racialized characters, also known as racial colorblindness, has televisual antecedents preceding Rhimes' hit series. Although all that may be true, the show's whiteness, middle-classness, and inoffensiveness did not diffuse its threat to entrenched racist positions. The historical positioning of Julia as a forerunner in colorblind television compels us to not forget that part of the reason assimilation occurs is to connect a society together for consumption. Although Julia was designed to be so radically neutral as to not offend audiences, hostile viewers still felt there was still too much blackness on their television screens. This convention had the potential to render the bodies of color powerless to express their difference, which, given the cultural context of the time, may have proven a valuable goal. Ultimately, what these medical shows suggest is that the networks have not been responding to black desire as to be seen as much as they are responding to what and how much white viewers want to see of black life. Grey's Anatomy has differentiated itself from other medical shows by creating a diverse world of doctors, almost half the cast are men and women of color, and then never acknowledging it. A strategy of quantity over quality representation, Grey's illustrates how diversity is more gimmick than innovation. Rhimes focuses on her show's generic differences, which allows her to divert attention from her position as a black female showrunner. Rhimes is quite similar to the discourse surrounding her show. She a proponent of diversity, yet a believer in universality. She is, on one hand, celebrated as one of the only black female executive producers of a primetime network drama, and she is, on the other hand, racially neutralized as a hardworking individual with a strong work ethic. In other words, systemic issues can exist, but if one is immersed in her work, she cannot feel the effects of her limitations. Rhimes' position allows her the privilege to feel relatively immune to the disadvantages women of color in the television industry regularly face. Warner argues that the way Rhimes self-presents as a colorless female writer is a discursive strategy deployed to divest race from the cultural context for herself and her cast. Newspaper articles implicitly acknowledge the lack of people of color on television and see Grey's as a corrective for years of neglect. Rhimes' innovative blind casting could have properly deployed, changed the visual representation of minorities on the small screen, ultimately satisfying watchdog racial action groups that threaten potential advertising revenue. The NAACP and NAALP threatened to boycott the networks in response to the complete lack of diversity in their fall premiere lineups. Quelling talk of boycotts with promises to be intentional about diversity, the networks tried to make use of every opportunity to prove they had changed. One of those opportunities came when the networks realized they could make casts more racially diverse without having to acknowledge difference. This innovation, called blind casting, insisted that as opposed to the traditional method of network executives, casting directors and talent managers generating casting breakdowns that explicitly listed the race and ethnicity of each character for auditioning purposes, the producer not specify the race of any roles. What's more, Rhimes' investment in normalizing non-racialized characters exemplifies the liberal individualistic discourse of a post-racial America. In this revisionist history, all the sins of the past are absolved in the heroic efforts of a few dissidents during the civil rights era. Proponents of a liberal individualism believe that the irrationality of prejudice can only be overcome through logical behavioral modifications, such as not seeing people as individuals but as individuals like themselves. The ideal of colorblindness was to transcend stereotypes in favor of treating people as individuals free from racial group identification. Being free from racial group identification is the crux of post-race ideology, because separating an individual from his or her group status also disconnects the person from historical trajectory of disenfranchisement. The individual alone becomes responsible for her lot in life and cannot claim racism as an injustice or an issue. On the surface, this sounds like an equitable statement. However, we must remember that representation does not exist in a vacuum, but rather continues along a historical trajectory of naturalized stereotypes and racialized tropes, the magical Negro notwithstanding. Thus, as much as Rhimes may desire all of her characters to be just the same, historically representations prevent this from becoming a reality. The blind casting of those actors in the roles hence works to displace and neutralize conservative fears of minority takeovers by creating the aspirationally utopic space Rhimes envisioned. As long as the actors were hired race-blind for the parts and just happened to be African American, then it's not a conspiracy that they are highly coveted positions. Post-race politics that deploys colorblindness as a strategy ultimately allows these cast members to be in these positions because whatever subversion the racial difference may have caused has been stripped away in favor of a feel-good sentiment that diversity and corporate multiculturalism are effective societal tools. Rhimes' discussion of reality that transcends race is significant because it demonstrates a belief that television representation alone can change preconceived notions about racialized groups. The problem, of course, is that because these characters are divorced from their cultural specificities, they are reduced to stereotypically shallow characterizations devoid of context from their marginalized groups of origin. In addition, one of the problems that arises from Rhimes' mode of disavowal is that the actors of color inadvertently step into racial tropes. Put simply, when characters of color are written normatively, i.e. white, and their history is not considered, the text becomes a breeding ground for unintentional stereotypes. Isaiah Washington and Patrick Dempsey were both up for the role of Dr. Shepard. Washington knew that Patrick Dempsey would win the role. As he states, ABC didn't want me to be Dr. Shepard. They wanted Patrick Dempsey, so there's your answer. It's not daring. It's not daring. That is off limits. Interview cuts in. So you're saying that still, it's not going anywhere. I'll be disappearing on you like Dave Chappelle if I said anything different. Washington's tepid acknowledgement of the network's implicit demand for white lead comes as close to a provocative statement about racial issues as the publicity around the show will allow. Put simply, casting a black male lead against a white female lead on a broadcast television series is industrially considered a difficult coupling to sell to a mainstream white audience. Washington was experiencing a double consciousness that is, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on it in amused contempt and pity, is a component of Black life in America. This disacknowledgement of that in the circumstances these three characters have found themselves in is disingenuous. As insincere as the dissonance Rhimes' characters find themselves in, the point is clear. The goal of post-race identity is denying this double consciousness because it possesses and undermines their very deracialization. Racial transcendence functions not only as a narrative structure for these characters, but also as a lens for audiences to look past the obvious cultural reasons that may make interracial romances difficult. As Dr. Cheeto Childs argues that placing the romance in the past generates a sort of racial displacement as found in Grace. Childs says, beyond not showing interracial couples, another strategy of invisibility is to have an interracial union that happened in the past. By placing the relationship in the past, the show can claim to be racially progressive while not having to deal with actually presenting an interracial relationship. Ignoring the cultural differences in the favor of colorblindness and diversity is a dishonest maneuver designed to ensure comfort at the expense of resonance for people of color. Cultural specificity does not mean that the show needs to have a racial problem solved every week. However, there does need to be a nod to the world, not just as Shonda Rhimes envisions it or experiences it as an individual, but to the world as it actually is. Rhimes' self-fashioning as post-civil rights and post-feminist is smart because it guarantees the network that she has no secret revolutionary agendas and will serve their primary demographic. What Rhimes' decision made us suggest is a difficulty in configuring racial parity and acceptability. Rhimes' blind casting works to acknowledge difference in ways that will cause the least amount of discomfort to white audiences while providing an illusion that under liberal individualism, the marketplace will do right by historically marginalized individuals. This is a post-racial network world.